College in Wuhan, China. And he's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and a member of Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Honor Society. In addition to his teaching and clinical work and practice, Dr. Barish also plays jazz trumpet. I also would like to mention that Dr. Barish has published other books and was the winner of multiple prestigious awards, among which were awards by the International Book Award, Eric Hoffer Book Award, the USA Best Book Award, the National Parenting Publications Award, and others. So thank you very much, Ken, for agreeing to be with us today. Dr. Kavita Avula is a licensed psychologist and certified group psychotherapist. She's a fellow of the American Group Psychotherapy Association and dean of the National Group Psychotherapy Institute. Through her organization, Therapists Beyond Borders, she has been engaged in organizational consulting with global institutions, hospitals, universities, organizations, and counseling centers. Dr. Avula is a large group convener and consultant and has been interested in supporting groups and societies on how to coexist less violently. She will share her reflections on her international critical incident response engagements. Most recently, she has been collaborating with Serbian and other international group analysts by implementing the reflective citizens methodology to help polarized communities dialogue in ways that facilitate listening and understanding. Thank you very much, Dr. Avula, for agreeing to be with us today. And I just want to let everybody know that Dr. Naaman will unfortunately not be able to join us today. We hope to maybe hear from him on another occasion. So before we proceed to hear from our esteemed speakers, I would like to take a few minutes to say share a few thoughts about the topic of today. We might have a lot of differences amongst us, but we probably all can agree about the fact that we are living in extraordinarily divisive times on all levels. The way we voted in the recent elections, our stance with regards to the Hamas attack and the ensuing war in Gaza, the rise in anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant views, all of these have created a crisscross of fault lines under our feet, not only between political parties, but actually within the organizations and the social networks that we have been part of. And amongst colleagues, amongst people we used to think of as friends, and even amongst relatives within the family. Our previous affiliations and our previous sense of belonging are critically threatened these days because of the complexities of the issues we face and the intersectionality of our identities. And all of these, in many unexpected and unanticipated ways, create a sense of othering that with groups we used to feel part of. At times, it actually feels that we are on an accelerating path of destruction, fragmentation, and even destruction of our planet. As clinicians, most of us have been working with individuals, couples, and families in the privacy of our offices. And these issues recently have definitely invaded the individual and family work. People are expressing intense anxieties about these issues and intense disagreements and difficulties in the relationship amongst family members. And it also invaded the therapeutic relationship and its traditional boundaries with regards to the politics of both patient and therapist. I would like to show you a picture. I'll share the screen for one image only, and that will be this image. This is a painting. It's a very large size painting that was created by Paul Kor. He was a child survivor of the Holocaust, and he did not address his experiences throughout his very rich career as a painter until his very, very late years, when he created six paintings that he titled Six Paintings for the 6 Million. And this painting is a very important one, in my opinion, for the uh, thoughts that I'm about to share, because it really shows us very visually how we do not necessarily attribute the same level of humanness to anyone who shares the humanoid form. As you can see in the left side of the picture, this humanoid form has much less of the characteristics of the people and their relationships as depicted on the right-hand side of the painting. It's also very touching to me that when my mother died in her Shiva, I discovered that Paul Kor is a relative through marriage. So what I want to say is that Paul Kor captured in the painting a lot of what social psychology told us about some pretty sobering, if not grim, lessons about our deeply ingrained tendencies to see ourselves as more human than you, if I may quote the title of a paper by Nick Haslam and his colleagues. Some of the seminal insights from the body of work of researchers like Lyons and Palladino and Haslam, among others, in a very rich field of research by now, demonstrates that there are at least two ways to define humanness and two ways to deprive those whom we consider outgroups from sharing equally in our humanness. And one of the ways that people have defined humanness is the human uniqueness, as it's referred to. And that defines humanness based on characteristics that distinguish us from other animals, such as language and culture and moral and ethical reasoning. These people in that line of research also speak about secondary emotions as different from primary emotions. Primary emotions are innate ones, they're universal, they include such emotions as fear and anger, but secondary emotions are those that we have when the primary ones are evoked and then combined with thoughts, cognitive processes, social norms, and the individual experiences that sort of wrap around those thoughts. The body of empirical studies in this line of research has shown that uniquely human emotions, secondary emotions, are much more likely to be attributed to those people that we consider like us, our in-group members, than to other people whom we consider out-groups. This phenomenon, termed infrahumanization, is a form of emotional prejudice. And it was definitely differentiated in multiple studies from just favoritism for our own in-group members, because it differentiates between us and others, even in human traits or qualities that we don't necessarily think are so positive. So it's different than just favoritism. It's really seeing them as less human in many ways than us. And it has also been shown to not be something that we can reduce simply to the question of who are we more familiar with, and therefore we assign more humanness to those with whom we are more familiar. It was definitely shown to be different from that. On those levels, as I say, infrahumanization has been shown to be a pretty robust empirical findings that has many implications. Another way that researchers have defined humanness is what is considered the concept of human nature or human essence. And that does not rely on qualities that differentiate us from animals, from other animals. It relies on those qualities that we see as critical or essential or core elements of what it means to be human, even if it doesn't distinguish us from other species. So primarily, people have looked at things as our social connections and the structures that are so critical to human existence, and feelings such as empathy and compassion, which refer to the ability that we have to share and feel the feelings of other people, and our self-awareness, a sense of self, a self-consciousness, the capacity for self-reflection, and so forth. And studies in these lines as well have supported the unfortunate conclusion that infrahumanization is indeed a robust empirical phenomenon. Taking it one step further, even, Leyens and Palladino and others, but I will quote Leyens and Palladino, stated, dehumanization is mostly discussed in the context of extreme behavior, such as genocide or torture. However, it is a common phenomenon that is not restricted to extreme behaviors, but is often also part of milder forms of discrimination. So dehumanization is a step further from infrahumanization, and the central feature of dehumanization is the diminished attribution of or consideration of how the other person feels, of the mental states of others. And we know, unfortunately, that considering the feelings of others and the mental states of others is critical for empathy. If we don't consider it, we are much more likely to allow ourselves to behave towards these people or others in ways that we wouldn't otherwise allow ourselves to exercise. So why do I speak about these? It's because literal infrahumanization and dehumanization have been very rampant in political comments used in recent years by multiple politicians in speaking about members of the other side, sometimes even speaking about them or calling them all kinds of types of animals, and certainly not with the affection that we use when we talk about our pets. Neuroscience, the new emerging field, has brought us even new perspectives on the capacity to see certain other people as less human than us, and showed us that while primarily social cognitions, thinking about other people and ourselves, seem to take place primarily in the medial prefrontal cortex, that particular area activates less in our brain when we think about others who elicit feelings of disgust, which is an emotion that we can feel both towards objects. Oh, this is a disgusting piece of rotten meat. We can also feel it about people. People who elicit disgust in us are actually processed in the brain in a region that is anatomically different and distinct from social groups who elicit only strictly social cognitions in us. So what is very interesting about this is that studies show that there is an overlap in the brain between what happens when we think about something that is an object that's disgusting, or what is considered, for example, pathogen disgust. Those things that our species learned to be disgusted by because they learned from experience that those things can make us sick if we come close to them, such as feces and rotten meat and open wounds and things like that. And then there is also what is considered moral disgust. What the feelings of disgust that we feel when we view someone else as behaving in morally very reprehensible ways. Both of these things, as we can talk about perhaps later if people are more interested in it, are discussed in relation to their roots in the evolutionary psychology of our species. It was less energy costly to just stay away from something disgusting, such as feces or someone who appears sick. We don't have to run away from them and expend a lot of energy. And that's much better at a time when we can't approach the refrigerator to replenish that energy. It's also a lot more um, uh, reasonable under those considerations to use um, passive kind of punishing transgressions within the clan rather than using direct aggression, which may actually cost us the fact that the person that we're trying to punish will hit us back or do something nasty to us in return. So, moral disgust is a form of passively punishing transgressions by our clan's people. And there seems to be, as I say, an overlap in the activation of those regions in our brain when we feel disgust of this kind or of that kind. So the evidence overall, unfortunately, shows us the very strong evolutionary roots of our tendency to develop emotional biases and to view others as less human than us. And the recent years are evidencing a frightening decline in the forces that bind us together and help us work towards shared goals. I'm hoping that the presentations today, which I think are very interesting, will show us some kind of a roadmap, some suggestions based on the extensive clinical experience of Dr. Barish and Dr. Avula to find a way to counter these deeply rooted prehistoric uh, tendencies that we share and find a way to use our wisdom in order to create the safe, democratic society, multicultural, multiracial society that we wish to live in and that we hope our children will live in. Thank you very much. And I would ask Dr. Barish if you can start your presentation. You are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Uri. Thank you for your introduction. I'm going to share my screen so I can put up a PowerPoint which summarizes some of the ideas I'm going to present. Okay, I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak at this meeting and to offer some ideas about how people of different political beliefs can better understand each other and how we can make progress toward more constructive political conversations and find common ground. Respectful and constructive dialogue is vanishing from American political life. There is arguably no more urgent question for American society today than how we can listen and talk with each other constructively with less hostility and contempt. Today, I will offer a brief explanation of our political differences, why we continue to disagree about fundamental issues of American life. I will then describe 8 principles of constructive dialogue and reasoned debate, alternatives and antidotes to the angry, repetitive, and unproductive arguments that now dominate American political culture. I will describe a way of listening, thinking, and talking about political differences that allows us more often to understand each other's concerns, and then, when we continue to disagree, even when we firmly believe that our opponents are wrong, to discuss our disagreements with greater civility and respect. The climate of American politics has devolved a long way since Al Gore in 1992 was able to say about his Republican opponents, they're not bad people. And when George W. Bush appealed for national unity and religious tolerance following the attacks of September 11th. Many of us no longer feel this way. We are now divided not only in our political beliefs, but in how we feel about each other. We no longer think of the opposing party as people we disagree with. We think, as Gore and Bush told us not to, that they are bad people. By 2019, over 42% of both Republicans and Democrats believe that members of the other party are not just bad for politics, they are downright evil. An erosion of empathy for those who disagree with us may be the most important cause and symptom of our current polarization and hatred. Arlie Russell Hochschild calls this our empathy wall. Today, I will offer some advice on how we can cross the empathy wall. As a college student in the early 1970s, I was puzzled by the consistency of political attitudes across different issues in different spheres of life. At that time, political leaders who espoused conservative positions on economic and social issues also tended to be hawkish on questions of foreign policy. Liberal politicians, conversely, favored increased spending on social welfare programs and opposed increased military spending and the war in Vietnam. I wondered then and now, why do these attitudes and opinions go together? What is the logical, or more likely emotional, relationship of these different opinions? This consistency of political opinions, with some exceptions, remains true today, perhaps to an even greater extent, and includes many more issues. So this is the first question. What is the inner coherence of liberal and conservative ideas? What is their deep grammar? What is the theme that can be heard throughout many different variations? What are our disagreements really all about? This first question, or first set of questions, then quickly led to a second question and then others. What is the origin of our conservative and liberal attitudes and opinions? Why are some of us hawks and some of us doves? And then third, a different set of questions, more important questions. How can we understand each other and talk together in a more productive way? Why do friends and family members discuss politics for decades, present arguments and evidence for their views, but remain adamant in their opinions and not change their minds? Except sometimes they do. And why? I believe that we achieve a better understanding of our political attitudes if we look beyond politics. Liberalism and conservatism are not limited to politics. Liberal and conservative impulses and sensibilities are present in science and religion, in music and art, in how we raise our children, and in every organization and institution. This broader perspective on liberal and conservative opinions suggests that liberalism and conservatism represent a fundamental tension in our emotional lives, present in all of us. At the most general level, liberalism and conservatism reflect an inherent tension in human nature between the instincts of empathy, expressed as compassion, and self-preservation, that is, security, and reflect the feelings, concerns, values, and social priorities animated by these different human instincts Ralph Waldo Emerson called this our primal antagonism. Liberals and conservatives differ in how much openness, change, and assimilation feels right to us, and to what extent change is felt as an existential threat. We are often faced with conflicts and dilemmas of this kind in many aspects of our lives, some more consequential than others, as individuals, and especially as members of institutions and social groups. The specific concerns and issues are different in every case, but the theme is the same, present in many variations. How much change, how much can we change and still preserve the distinctiveness of our institutions and our culture? How open can we be to new ideas and practices and still preserve our identity? Liberalism, in all spheres of life, is characterized by openness. In social and political life, liberalism is animated by a particular kind of openness, empathy, our openness to the feelings of others, especially the perception of suffering and injustice. When we are a liberal, we allow others into our circle of concern. The larger and more inclusive our circle of concern, the more liberal we become. In contrast, conservatism in politics, science, and the arts, in religion, and in all institutions is animated by a perceived threat to something valued. We become conservative when we believe that something essential to our way of life, our status, our values, our culture, or our identity is threatened. We are conservative to the extent that we find meaning and security in traditions and existing institutions and believe that these traditions or institutions are endangered. There is an inherent tension between these two cognitive emotional systems. We have evolved emotional and cognitive biases for both empathic concern and for the perception of danger. The threat we perceive may be imagined, or it may be real. It may be real but exaggerated. Threat erodes empathy and increases our capacity for cruelty. Empathy softens the harshness of our judgments and our actions. In threatening circumstances, we draw a greater boundary between ourselves and others. We build a wall, emotionally or physically. Although we sometimes think otherwise, we are motivated in our political opinions first by feelings and secondarily by ideas or beliefs. Our political opinions begin with what feels right or wrong to us. Because our opinions are derived from feelings, to understand why we disagree and how we can talk with each other more constructively, we need to understand why our opponents feel the way they do. In contemporary America, we are increasingly divided by feelings of resentment, shame, and fear. On the right, our current politics is dominated by grievances, that undeserving others are getting what we have worked hard for, that liberal values are destroying the moral foundations of society, and that children are being taught to dishonor and hate the country they should be proud of. These grievances have become increasingly malignant, spreading for several decades from the bottom up as feelings of disrespect and from the top down by demagogues and partisan media, now justifying efforts at censorship and threats of violence against those who disagree. On the left, political attitudes are dominated by a different set of grievances, a feeling of injustice that in many instances has also become malignant, an arrogant and self-righteous demand, also justifying censorship and self-censorship through fear and acts of cancellation, jeopardizing the careers of decent people who may have chosen the wrong word or who simply disagree. Extreme and dangerous political attitudes, however, most often originate with an understandable concern. If we can talk about these feelings at their source, as a response to real events, we have a chance to arrest this malignant process. To strengthen support for democracy, we need to learn to listen and talk with each other with greater empathy, understand each other's concerns, and find common ground. Successful discussion of any important disagreement in politics and in our personal lives is based on a simple premise. We need to listen to each other. But listening is difficult, especially in politics. In most political discussions, we are not really listening. We have already formed a judgment or an opinion. We are waiting for an opportunity to present our arguments and defend our side, looking for weaknesses to attack, not truths to acknowledge. Constructive dialogue requires a sustained effort to act towards others with dignity and respect. This is the first principle of constructive conversations. In political discussions, especially in our political climate, this is easier said than done. This principle has been persuasively articulated by Donna Hicks of the Harvard Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Hicks argues that progress towards a peaceful solution of long-standing conflicts depends on a single core principle. In Hicks's workshops and negotiations, successful conflict resolution begins with a commitment to dignity and fails without it. When discussions and negotiations break down, the emotional undercurrent that has disrupted the reconciliation process is almost always an unacknowledged or unrepaired violation of dignity. Dignity violations are the elephant in the room. Hicks therefore believes that successful conflict resolution requires a language of dignity, an explicit affirmation of each person's dignity, an awareness of potential dignity violations, and a willingness to work toward repair of perceived violations when they occur. Principle 2, learn someone's personal story. One of the best ways to begin a more constructive political discussion is to learn more about someone's personal story. When we make an effort to get to know in detail about someone's life, we will almost always find some common experience or shared value, even with people whose political opinions are antithetical to our own. If we want to understand someone's opinions, we should listen to their stories. Stories have an emotional appeal and a truth value that ideas often lack. Stories are, to some extent, unarguable. We do not often change or open our minds when we are exposed to different opinions and ideas. Ideas begin with stories, and when we are uncertain about what to think, we instinctively return to the stories that are the source of our ideas. All of us have families. We were all children. Many of us are parents. Most of us have jobs or hobbies that require effort, discipline, or creativity, as well as some degree of anxiety, frustration, conflict, and stress, and when we are fortunate, feelings of satisfaction and pride. We all know how it feels at some point in our lives to feel that we've been treated unfairly, to be ignored, excluded, or disrespected, to feel that our effort has not been recognized or appreciated, or to feel that we don't belong. Our interest and willingness to learn someone's personal story is an affirmation of dignity. We have communicated that her experience matters to us. If we listen to people's stories, we may still disagree. Listening to someone's story may not change our opinion about how to solve a problem. We may believe that they have not told us the whole story, but personal stories almost always humanize our opponent, and our hostility will be softened. The point of listening to someone's story is not to approve or disapprove, but to allow ourselves to be influenced emotionally, to recognize more deeply than we have before that human problems are complex, and to move us away from oversimplification and certainty toward a better understanding of another person's values and concerns. Principle 3, empathy and moral imagination. I argued earlier that empathy, expressed in different ways, for example, as feelings of compassion and a wider circle of concern, is the core of a liberal worldview and a liberal political philosophy. I'm speaking now about empathy in a related but somewhat different sense. Empathy is a basic human need and a necessary precondition for dialogue and mutual understanding, regardless of our political beliefs. Empathy is an instinctive, unconscious emotional response to the feelings of others. But it is also a conscious choice, a deliberate and often difficult effort to suspend judgment, to hear about another person's story, to imagine ourselves in similar life circumstances, and to see and feel the world from their point of view. Empathy, the journalist Jennifer Finney Boylan reminds us, is an act of moral imagination. We can choose to feel or to turn away from someone else's joy or pain. Constructive discussion of any disagreement begins with a gesture of empathy. A gesture of empathy changes the tone of our disagreement, sometimes in a subtle but still noticeable way. Even small gestures of empathy convey a willingness to listen that almost always leads to some softening of our defensiveness and the harshness of our judgments on both sides. Principle 4, from debate to dialogue. When we make a sustained effort to regard our opponents with dignity and respect, when we listen to their personal stories and tell them our own, and when we make a conscious effort to see and feel the world the way they do, we have taken several steps away from unproductive argument toward a new form of discussion. We have begun a dialogue. Dialogue is much more than a civil and respectful exchange of ideas. Dialogue is an uncommon and qualitatively different kind of communication. In a dialogue, each person is trying to learn more about why someone else feels and thinks the way they do. Debate is the opposite of dialogue. The purpose of debate is to win an argument. In a debate, we assume that, in a dialogue, we assume that many people have pieces of the answer and that together we are more likely to find a solution. In a dialogue, we acknowledge that someone else's thinking may improve our own. We are looking to discover new options rather than to change someone's mind. You can't win or lose a dialogue. Principle 5, from opinion to concerns. Political discussions are almost always framed as a choice between two opposing opinions. Of course, we are entitled, as we often say, to our opinions. It is also true, however, that we form our opinions too quickly and we cling to them too stubbornly. Especially in our mistrustful and polarized society, expressing an opinion, even when we support our ideas with logic and evidence, rarely changes anyone's mind or helps us find common ground. If our goal is to have a constructive discussion, it is far more important to understand someone's concerns, and then in response, to express our concerns. This principle is more than a semantic difference. Emotionally and logically, concerns precede opinions. Once we have formed an opinion, some degree of hardening has already taken place. An opinion is a conclusion. When we debate opinions, we are beginning at what should be the end. When we discuss issues in this way, we may find that although we disagree about the causes of problems or what to do about them, we often share concerns. Or we may not share a concern, at least not to the same degree. But most concerns are likely to be understandable, a concern that we might share in some circumstances. A conversation about concerns is different than a conversation about opinions. We debate opinions. We discuss concerns. This simple shift from opinions to concerns allows a much more successful discussion in both family relations and politics. It is now a new ballgame, a different kind of conversation for families and for political opponents. Principle 6, intellectual charity. The principle of intellectual charity is fundamental to constructive conversation and reasoned argument. This principle states that in any discussion, we should acknowledge and accept the best version of a person's ideas, not an exaggerated or distorted version, that is, a straw man. Adherence to the principle of charity is rare in American politics. Our political divide is fueled by caricatures, consciously or unconsciously drawn, of what others actually believe and why they believe what they do. The philosopher Gary Gutting pointed out that intellectual charity, because it engages someone's most reasonable ideas, allows us to make more persuasive arguments beyond simple assertions of our opinion. An argument, Gutting reminds us, is not a bludgeon to beat opponents into submission, but a tool for intellectual development. Or more colloquially, as Tina Fey says in Mean Girls, calling someone stupid doesn't make you any smarter. Uncharitable interpretation is a danger whenever we characterize liberals or conservatives as a group. We find examples of this fallacy almost daily, not only in partisan politics and in social media, but in books and punditry by thoughtful people who should know better. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman described a common form of uncharitable scientific debate he called angry science. In angry science, scientists publish the results of their experiments and the conclusions based on their research. Opponents then challenge the conclusions. In Kahneman's experience, scientific opponents often present, quote, a summary caricature of the target position, refute the weakest argument in that caricature, and declare the total destruction of the adversary's position. The argument then continues in repeated exchanges, no resolution is achieved, and no one changes their mind. I've not found a better description of our political arguments. As with all the recommendation for reasoned argument I will offer, there are limits to this principle. Not every charitable understanding is correct. We still have the right to strong opinions and deep disagreements about what is right and wrong. We have the right to pass judgment on someone's behavior, to call out dishonesty and hypocrisy, and to identify offensive and dangerous ideas. We have the right to be angry at injustice. But we should at least consider a charitable understanding. Even when we conclude that our opponent is hypocritical, that her arguments are rationalizations of self-interest or an excuse for bigotry, we should first consider that perhaps they are not. Principle 7, intellectual humility. As a companion to the principle of charity, we also need to cultivate an attitude of intellectual humility. I'm using the word humility both in its common meaning and in a more specific sense. We should begin with personal humility, recognizing the limits of our ability or virtue, that others know more than we do, and that in any specific instance, we might be wrong. But I would like to add an additional meaning to intellectual humility that is especially relevant to political debates. We should regard it as axiomatic that every ideology and every political belief has limits. Intellectual humility requires that we make a sustained effort to specify the limits of our opinions and beliefs. An attitude of humility requires that we recognize the complexity of most social and political problems. Intellectual humility is based on the understanding that every policy, domestic or international, is likely to have both good and bad effects. In the real world, visions and philosophies break down. There are almost always exceptions and valid competing concerns. Humility requires an awareness that there are perspectives we may not have considered. Finally, Principle 8, from ideology to pragmatism. When we listen to another person's concerns and then consider the most reasonable form of her opinions, that is, intellectual charity, and acknowledge the inevitable limitations of our own, intellectual humility, we have moved away from ideology toward pragmatism. I'm using the word pragmatism in a specific sense. I'm not speaking about being pragmatic as a political tactic, that is, as a willingness to compromise or a recognition that there are limits to what can be accomplished at any time. Being pragmatic in these ways is often necessary. But I'm speaking now about pragmatism in a meaning closer to its philosophical origins in the writings of William James. The truth is not found in abstract principles or beliefs, but in effects that can be observed. Pragmatism is about what works and what doesn't. Pragmatic debates are very different from ideological debates. Ideology imposes constraints on thought and problem solving. Ideology limits the problems we see, the stories we listen to, and the solutions we are willing to consider. Pragmatism removes these constraints. Pragmatism continues asking questions. Pragmatism is anti-ideological and an antidote to certainty. Pragmatism also reduces our tendency toward personal attacks. Our disagreement is about how to solve a problem, not who you are. Pragmatism, James wrote, is open-minded. We can never be entirely pragmatic about political issues and problems. Our temperament or our vision of human nature will still be present in our thinking. Our values and worldview select the questions we ask and the solutions we prefer. Even when we accept the principle of pragmatism, we will still feel differently about important problems and propose solutions, and we will still disagree. I'm not advocating humility and pragmatism as substitutes for ambitious policies and inspiring ideals. We need political leaders, both conservative and liberal, who are able to articulate a vision of a better society that helps bring us closer together. The angry and contemptuous language now commonplace in American politics is one of the most disheartening aspects of our current political culture, undermining support for the democratic process. As citizens, we cannot do much to change how politicians speak, except with our votes. But we can change how we listen and speak with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barish, for this beautiful presentation. What we will do now is we will go straight to Dr. Avula's presentation, and we will have a discussion and amongst ourselves, and perhaps take some questions from the chat when Dr. Avula is done presenting her piece. Dr. Avula?
Thank you so much, Dr. Felsen, and thank you, Dr. Barish, for the inspiring presentation. There are a lot of overlaps between what we say. Many of us have been thinking about how best to coexist during these polarized times. As Turkish, Cyprus-born American psychiatrist Vamik Volkan puts it, under certain circumstances, we stop seeing the beauty of diversity and we do horrible things. It comes down to the simple question, how do we see difference in a benign way? My career as an international psychologist has brought me into contact with populations who are at this point conflict-ridden, disaster-impacted parts of the world with fragile intergroup and intergroup relations. My role has been to support humanitarian workers, expatriate and local, through these highly distressing circumstances. At times, I've felt like I've been asked to do the impossible. When I approach a conflict, I think about the context that is creating the meaning that something is problematic. Understanding the context allows us to make sense of things and also to shift meaning. For example, in many of the countries that I've visited, someone makes the sweeping statement, Kenyans don't speak to psychologists. Palestinians are not interested in psychotherapy. By asking for more information about the statement, I've been able to understand the story that has been told about psychologists or psychotherapy in the community so that I can honor it and make clarifications about my own story, about what I'm doing there. Given that many places around the world, there's a stigma, a story of stigma when it comes to seeking help or speaking to a therapist, I usually opt to introduce myself and my work in a psychoeducational informational event in which I offer another frame. My story is that seeking help is courageous. It's a logical choice to make contact with other people in times of great suffering so that we don't have to carry the load alone. I'm also clear that I don't have magic solutions. I'm not going to tell anyone what to do, but I do have space to hold the questions, seeing them as worthwhile. My experience has been that giving an individual or a group a sense of dignity, which is the state or quality of being worthy, can be transformative. Being seen or being witnessed in one's suffering decisively changes the outcome. Being willing to sit with somebody where they are is a dignified experience. It can restore a sense of power and control, at least temporarily. People can begin to access hope, community, and being in it together. When I listen to someone's story of suffering, I also feel dignified by the listening. If there's one thing that we know about the human experience, it's that we are inherently relational. We develop in the context of our relationships. We suffer in the context of our relationships, and we also heal in the context of relationship. I'm here to talk today about ways to access community, to suggest that we offer the experience of dignity to our fellow citizens, to identify superiority within each of us, and to find a way to embody humility and be in relationship with the people who have the ideologies that differ the most from our own. I'll describe the small and large group experience from a psychodynamic tradition, how they can each support us. And then I'll also describe a specific process called the reflective citizens methodology that offers a specific invitation that facilitates the type of listening that Dr. Barish and I are advocating for. Part of the theory that I have about why we're in such a divisive place today is that many of us have been using superiority to address problems that are rooted in superiority. We yell at each other when we have different points of view. We pressure each other to think and believe different things, even though we've each been a lifetime in the making. Actually, more. Epigenetics tells us that we're already in the making before we're born. We dominate. When we want to address domination, we shame each other as though we don't engage in bias all of the time. When difference is seen as hostile or malignant, we begin to have huge, devastating problems. In today's society, this looks like cancel culture, calling out, fake news, and erasure of entire causes and peoples. Cancel culture has us cut off or cut out people who have starkly different views than we do. as if that isolation will bring anyone closer to our truth. Calling out has us correct others, oftentimes talking down to them, as if any one of us knows better than the other person what makes sense in this very complex world. Fake news is a product of our technologized society where we can easily be brainwashed to think what others want us to think. And then the wish to erase is a byproduct of difference becoming malignant. If we work to make our differences benign, beginning with ourselves, we can begin to heal the fractures, starting with our own communities. Groups, small or large, create a social microcosm of the world. We wind up doing in group what we do in our lives, but group offers a lower stakes environment to learn more about ourselves and to practice other ways of being. In groups, there's room for every person. It's a dignified experience. Differences are worked with and held. Process groups or group therapy works by offering an opportunity to understand our own relational patterns, in particular, the ones that keep us stuck or blocked, anxious or depressed, or unhappy and unfulfilled. Group can help to unlock the door to our vulnerabilities. In a safe enough space where there's containment and psychic holding, individuals can dare to say out loud what's usually unsayable. In this way, the small group, which is usually about 6 to 9 people, offers a sense of dignity, an experience of being seen and known and appreciated for all of who each of us are. Group psychotherapy is less known than individual psychotherapy, even though the research has repeatedly demonstrated that not only is group just as effective as individual psychotherapy, but in some cases even more effective. Group therapy in the psychodynamic tradition is unstructured and invites 6 to 9 members into a weekly 75 to 90-minute experience to engage with each other, no specific topic. Members are seated in a circle with nothing in the middle, no table, no agenda, no meal, just each other. The invitation is usually to put your thoughts and feelings into words about each other and the facilitator and to tell the most meaningful story of your life. The small group offers the experience of being known personally with all of one's nuances, mannerisms, and history. As each person becomes seen, new relational experiences become possible and new neural pathways are built because, as we know, the brain is plastic. Neurons can be rewired and created, which means that we're each capable of change. The large group experience, in contrast, is often used for educational purposes. As a social microcosm, the large group allows us to study ourselves when the individual and individuals are no longer seen in the way that you would be in a small group. And this is because the large group experience usually has 30 or more, sometimes hundreds, 100, 200, 300 people in one group. It helps us to understand society, which is a large group, by illuminating conscious, preconscious, and unconscious dimensions of the broader sociocultural political environment that influence our communities, colleagues, families, and clients. Large group is known for its volatile nature and also for its transformative potential. Large group has captured the imagination of group thinkers for generations. When the 20th century first began, Gustave Le Bon assembled people into what he called organized crowds and shared his observation that a crowd is as easily heroic as it is criminal, countering the notions that crowds can only be barbaric. Over 100 years after Le Bon's observations, we see contemporary versions of organized crowds that are a part of our everyday lives, whether it's campaign rallies or protest marches, town hall meetings, classrooms, radio, television, podcasts, Substacks, unions, and now internet and social media listservs and platforms. Participating in large group can be daunting at first. It's terrifying, actually, for most people. Over time, the group engages its sense of civility and civic mindedness in moving towards systemic change by embodying and studying the very dynamics that impede us. Membership, according to Volkan, in a large group promotes self-esteem, well-being, and cooperative living. A multiplicity of large group identities across individuals create tension and conflict, as well as the opportunity for collective learning, grief, mourning, understanding, and transformation. Large group, when done in person, offers in a spiral. Seats are placed in a spiral formation with the center, or first chair, and an end, last chair. The way our team does it, the large group team at the National Group Psychotherapy Institute, we have 5 consultants who consult to the large group process. We put our students who are part of a 2-year training program into a spiral, and as they work to engage, we help them to understand what they're doing with each other. In this kind of large group, it's not always possible to see everybody, and it's not always possible to even know who's speaking because there's so many people in that spiral. I want to illustrate how large group process can lead to civic mindedness and responsibility. Recently, in our Group Psychotherapy Institute, the 2-year program, we offer 3 weekends a year that are 2-day weekends. And our large groups are interspersed with small groups and plenary or didactic experiences. So we were doing one of these large groups, and members, it was this particular large group happened days after the election. So the group came in quite full. As members talked about Trump and his supporters, there was a sense of those people and what they are doing to us, rather than what we are doing to ourselves and each other. Our large group team began to make interpretations that helped the group to see the dynamics that were at play in the group right now. One of our teams stated, "The group is talking as though Trump and what he represents is out there rather than in here, in each of us." In this way, the group was invited to become aware of the parts of ourselves that we prefer to unconsciously disavow and project into the other. Challenging the primitive binary of us versus them, our team supported the group in seeing how we each are us and we each are them. One by one, group members began to own the parts of Trump that exist in each of us, the part of us that wants to see one group as inherently better than the other, or the parts of us that are threatened by difference and want to destroy it, the parts of us that are intolerant. In making this connection, members began to tap into their sense of humility and shifted from statements of dominance and superiority to statements of accountability and ownership. In this way, the group shifted to an empowered experience of understanding how we're each implicated in the divisions happening today. Members shared examples of their own intolerances, cutting off beloved family members and friends, ridiculing people who are not like us. The feeling changed from one of anger and hostility to a feeling of sadness and pain. Expanded to the global context, we've experienced the communities globally moving into binaries of who's right, who's wrong, whose life is worth being saved, and whose life is not worth being saved, whether we're talking about Palestinians and Israelis, Hindus and Muslims, Republicans or Democrats, and so on. Large group addresses these divisive binaries, enabling people to see other people as people. In war, people are often reduced to animals, objects, and less than human to justify mass killing and destruction. When we get to know the other and our own capacity for othering, we realize our part in the suffering that is happening to us, our part in making difference malignant. And once we realize that, we can do something about it. Most recently, we have been asked to bring large group to organizations. Typically, we've done large group with psychotherapists, most often group therapists and group analysts. Now organizations have been asking us to do large group for, in their organizations. I've been in collaboration with Serbian psychiatrist Dr. Marina Mojovic, who developed the reflective citizens methodology with Dr. Jelena Sataric during the fall of Yugoslavia and what they call the horrible 90s. in Serbia. Social dreaming often opens the large group reflective citizen session, followed by thinking together in both small and large groups. And then at the end of the experience, there's a review and applications group. The reflective citizens methodology was co-created by citizen participants, citizen conveners, and colleagues from Serbia and abroad. These groups trusted the capacity of learning through experience of raw human exchanges in the true candid dialogue and citizens' responsibility. Reflective Citizens aspires to enable free sharing of thoughts, feelings, fantasies, dreams, hypotheses, opening minds to understanding the chaotic unconscious. The hope is to create a safe enough space for dialogue. It's clear that the goal is not to arrive at homogeneous conclusion, nor become a political movement. The more diverse the participants, the better. The space, Dr. Moyevich says, is to allow for freedom of thinking and for learning to listen and be heard, allowing space for feelings like despair, hate, rage, fear, guilt, and defenses against them. The reflective citizens methodology has one specific invitation as people listen to each other, and that is to resist the urge to convince. And in this way, each person is given a dignified experience, turning polarization on its head. In these groups, contentious issues are talked about, people are talked with instead of being talked at, and situations are worked through or held rather than being reenacted. In so many professional organizations and families, listservs, and social media platforms, we end up recreating the same conflicts that we're trying to address. For organizations, I've adapted the reflective citizens methodology so that the small groups are facilitated. In Dr. Moyevich's reflective citizens method, the small groups are leaderless. I like to have a facilitated small group where there is a skilled group practitioner who is guiding the group and helping the group to understand when somebody is not resisting the urge to convince. And so I find that to be more useful, particularly for organizations that really need a cohesive thread or some kind of orienting, or a compass orienting the group. It often starts with a 3 to 4 hour session that begins with an opening or a framing that includes vulnerability on my part and then the leader of the organization. And then it goes to a large group, followed by a facilitated small group, followed again by a large group. Dr. Roby Friedman calls that a large group sandwich. This sandwich can also happen in the opposite way, where a small group is followed by a large group, followed again by a small group. This balances out the safety of being known and the comfort of being in a small group with the terror and overwhelming nature of the large group. One organization's staff were upset that their leadership weren't making public statements about the Israel-Hamas war. Another organization had its own internal polarization about a beloved coach accused of sexual abuse. Another organization was contending with 2 public suicides that had happened within the organization. Large group has long been criticized for its cold, impersonal nature and the outward, uninhibited expression of anger and hostility, putting many people off from the experience. The directive in this reflective citizens method of resisting the urge to convince creates a different kind of environment. It creates a more inviting environment where people are working on their relationships with one another. Anger and hostility turn into other feelings. They turn into mourning, to grief, to communal crying sometimes. Having witnessed the desire to dominate, to be right, to tell the other what to think and how to think is so characteristic of large group behavior that we're trying to avoid in our societies. In the reflective citizens methodology, we have another alternative. By speaking with each other and by listening, we can begin to change. The possibilities for understanding and transformation become endless. As the 2023 Hamas attack resulted in a full invasion into Gaza by Israel, Dr. Moyevich and I, along with many other group analysts and large group conveners, came together to offer reflective citizens groups to our international community. These were virtual groups that were held online. And we were able to create that kind of space for our community globally to begin to metabolize and make sense of what's happening without recreating the same wars and face-offs that we each have in our group. Another thing that happens in reflective citizens global groups is that we become aware that we're not the center of the world. We become aware of the conflicts held by people in different regions of the world. We begin to see more dignified conversation in which each person's voice is welcome. Inevitably, we start to see people urging other people to believe what they believe, and we remind them of that urge not to convince. When people start to talk over each other, we slow them down. There's always a hosting team that consults to the reflective citizens group. We're often urging, let's listen to what this person has to say instead of scapegoating them. Scapegoating happens when a group takes the unwanted parts of ourselves, puts it into a vulnerable other who has a valence to be the scapegoat, and then tries to banish them, humiliate them, and send them out. The reflective citizens methodology actively challenges scapegoating and invites each of us to own those ugly parts that we want to put into the other, to own those parts as parts of ourselves. Personally, I've practiced this model one-on-one. I decided to reach out to the people who are most different from me in terms of our ideologies and to collaborate with them. I reached out as a person who has traveled to Palestine and a person who has been treated like, well, not like Palestinians, but approximate, adjacent to Palestinians because of the way I look in Israel. I have strong views about the conflict. And so I reached out to an Israeli colleague who has strong views about the conflict, diametrically opposed to my own, and asked him to work with me. He said, well, we first have to figure out if we can tolerate hearing each other. So I said, agreed, let's try and talk. And so we began to sit down and we practiced this reflective citizens idea that we would listen to each other. And we're clear that when we listen, it doesn't mean we agree. It means we are just listening and hearing, and we would resist the urge to convince. We began to do that. And the first time he did it for me, I was shocked because since 2010, so a long time, 15 years now, I've been talking about what I saw in Palestine. And for 14 of them, I have been told it's not happening. I've been met with silence. I've been told I don't know history, all kinds of things. To have an Israeli colleague sit down with the views that I know he has, listen to my story and what I experienced was so healing for me. It was incredibly healing to have that experience of dignity with the person who I know it was very hard to listen to what I had to say. We began co-leading together. And in doing so, in this work, we became friends. And I noticed that I could no longer listen to people who share my ideas villainize this colleague. I noticed that in our group, in our communities, when this colleague speaks, he gets villainized. He gets labeled as all kinds of things, narcissistic, selfish, evil-like. And I could no longer be in those communities that were doing that to him because he's no longer another, he's my friend. And so this journey that I have been on was put to the test when in a recent group that we were co-leading together in Northern California, I dared to say something that I would normally not say in a group when I'm facilitating, something that I knew would deeply upset him, but that would relieve a member of his shame. A member was disappearing in his shame, and I knew I could help that member by saying something very personal. And we were put to the test, and my Israeli colleague responded, and he said, I have very strong reactions to what you were saying, and I'm not going to talk about it. he resisted the urge to convince. And we could coexist in a way that we have not seen in the larger group community, where we're seeing a lot of violence and hostility and people turning on each other in extreme ways. So I'd like to just end by saying that there is something that we each can do today. We can stop talking about what's happening out there and start talking about what is happening within us and with each other, in our families, in our friend groups, in our classrooms, and in our communities. We can try to reach out to the people who are most different from us and sit down and say, I'm willing to listen to you. Would you be willing to listen to me? Understanding that listening doesn't mean agreement, but when we let go of the desire to control other people, we can find something else. Part of what I have found is that difference is no longer malignant. Difference has become benign between my Israeli friend and myself. Together, we're writing together. Together, we're finding ways to bring group work to all corners of the globe. One of the most hopeful experiences I had in the last couple of years was when he invited me to co-teach people in Iran about group psychotherapy. I didn't even know you could do group psychotherapy in Iran. It was an incredibly moving experience. We were doing this in 2023 after the Hamas attack and subsequent invasion. We were together teaching Iranians about group psychotherapy and how to use groups to heal the world, to give people a space to be dignified, to be seen and heard, and to hear all of the different points of view instead of turning on each other. Transformation starts with each of us in each of our own contentious relationships. And I'll end there so that we have time for question and discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Avula. So we heard a lot of very encouraging and hopeful possibilities from both of you. And yet, I think a question that you touched upon when you said how much enactment and how much hostility and antagonism we see in our own professional groups, yeah? How do we actually, what do we make of that? What do the two of you make of the fact that we, the professionals who did learn these beautiful principles of active listening and the benefits that they provide, are reenacting all of this so vehemently right now in all of these professional listservs and organizations? What does that mean about the translation of these trainings and of these cognitive, ideas into the actual emotional biases that we talk about, that you both and I did address in what we talked about. Dr. Barish, would you like to take it first, and then maybe you too, Dr. Avula?
Sure. First, but I first want to thank Kavita for just an amazing, excellent presentation. Thank you. There are so many similarities, so much overlap between our ideas. And we can probably get into that, but thank you for a terrific presentation that I learned from. I think it shows the extent to which we are all vulnerable to fear and resentment, a feeling of being threatened, and that when these emotions, resentment and fear, are evoked in us, it is very difficult for us to do in our personal lives what we do every day in our offices. So when I was writing about these principles of dialogue, it occurred to me that in my own personal life, when I'm having political conversations, I'm talking about principles that have been the organizing framework for my professional life for over 40 years. But I can't always do it when I'm talking politics. And we should recognize that. We recognize that we're all vulnerable. Especially when whether it's a deep perception of injustice, which we are entitled to, or a sense of being threatened, when our lives are being threatened, um, our way of life we feel is being threatened or is being threatened, that these evoke, as Kavita says, the need to convince, which was what I was talking about in terms of debate versus dialogue, right? And it's so difficult to do. The hopeful thing, I think, is that if we can do this just some of the time and in a small way, that changes things. So if we can have moments of empathy in the midst of an argument, or moments of an appreciation of someone's concerns, it changes the tone. And we're better able to arrest the malignancy, as the terrific example that Kavita gave about her Israeli colleague. And I think people who have done international negotiations think about this all the time. Herbert Kellman, who was Donna Hicks's mentor, talked about strategic optimism, finding what is positive in the midst of what is malignant. And again, this to me was so consistent with my work with families. Finding what is positive. This is what makes us successful in work with families. Finding what is positive in the midst of what is malignant or seems to be malignant. Martha Nussbaum talked about the practice of hope, doing things which connect us with other people in different ways. So I think that would be my answer. We are all vulnerable to this. We have to use our self-awareness, and we should make small changes, which then can become a virtuous cycle instead of a malignant cycle, and a virtuous cycle, and maybe even a butterfly effect, where that one small change leads to more changes. I'm sorry for going on too long, but that's
Thank you, Ken. Kavita?
Yeah, I think, therapists we're turning on each other because we're afraid. And many of us are traumatized. And, we know that when we are traumatized and terrified, we lose access to our prefrontal cortex, which, is in charge of judgment and thinking and all of the things that help us be more relationally grounded. So I think that, that's part of it. And in societies, we see cycles of violence and more Pacific times. We are in, a period that has more violence. And I see, I mean, the conflict feels threatening to people, but conflict is also an opportunity to do something very, very differently. In our particular listserv, I've found that people who are looking for space to be together and are looking for a different way rather than turning on each other. So we did a conference on peace and conflict, and which usually attracts group therapy people or group dynamics thinker. But at this particular one, we had the public or general therapists attending, who are really interested in figuring this out. The other thing I would say is not everybody is ready to be at the place to hear other people. I am resourced. And what I mean by that is I have spent years in community with BIPOC people, with other people of color, holding space for people of color, co-leading with people of color. And that has brought me a lot of nourishment and safety to be able to do what I'm doing now. So when people have multiple experiences of marginalization, multiple identities through which they experience marginalization, I wouldn't be expecting people in that place to do that work. So we have to be resourced and at the right place. So not everybody can do the same work at the same time. So considering where people are developmentally and allowing people to be on their journey is another factor that I would keep in mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both. You both mentioned that we are now at this particularly divisive time, particularly difficult time. My question again to both of you, I would like to hear what each of you thinks about Why now, first of all? And second, as a whole generation of young people are growing up watching this on TV, reading this everywhere, this very derogatory way of talking about opponents and these caricatures, as you said, Ken, of the other. How do we uh, help this generation mitigate these behaviors and these attitudes and do something different? Would you like to take that, each of you?
Sure. No, I think there's some hopefulness in the fact that despite the fact that our political language has become so dehumanizing, right? When immigrants are called vermin who are poisoning the blood of our country, to take one particularly egregious example, but there are many, many of them, and that this language can be politically effective, and that this language is then supported on the internet. We never had the internet before, and on media, on partisan media, which appeals to a niche. Surveys still show that a large majority of the country does not like this and disapproves. So that they are called in some surveys the exhausted majority. So there are still people out there who are looking for a return to dialogue or return to civil debate. um, and and we can take some optimism in that. So every little thing that we do, um, and we should educate students in the way that if we could take what Kavita is doing in her groups and do it on college campuses, that would make a tremendous difference. And if we can actually get people working together, many of the people whose work I read supported mandatory national service, so that we not just talk together, but we actually work together.
Mm.
I think I endorse that idea.
I just to add to that, I don't think, I really see that in all societies and throughout time, there are periods of violence and periods of being pacific. So I don't think it's just now. I think this is all, it's ongoing. We vacillate. Societies vacillate between, periods of unrest and periods of being pacific. And I mean, having traveled to many different places, South Sudan, Afghanistan, there have been these intense periods, throughout time. There's no society that's exempt from it, right? And so I also agree that technology has made it possible for people to reach a very, very large group of people in seconds around the world, and it's ignited things in a way where when we used to write letters to each other, things were a lot slower. So I think technology is really changing the way that we relate to each other as well.
So, one of the questions that goes back to what you said, Ken, how in our personal circles, it's even sometimes difficult. Uh, what would you say to a young person who watches this, sees this, and thinks, well, these are important people. This is how they talk. Why are you telling me that it's not okay to talk this way?
Uh, okay, that's a very difficult question. I again,
A lot of parents are dealing with this very difficult question right now.
so let's go back to our fundamental principle, and before we decide what to say to this person, to listen to them and to find out, okay, why do you think this is okay, and what are your concerns, and why do you have uh, learn more about why they feel the way they do. And I think that they are going to tell us that there are feelings of deep resentment. That's what the people who have studied this, Arlie Hochschild, who went to Louisiana and most recently to Kentucky and talked with actually people who, not only people who supported Trump, but white nationalists, um, and Catherine Kramer in Wisconsin, and they felt a deep sense of resentment that they just weren't being listened to. So even in the way we pose the question, what can I say to them? And that's the way we think. We should take a step back and say, let me listen to them first, and then challenge them in some small way.
I mean, young folk, I teach, I teach graduate level courses, and dynamic that I see sometimes if there is a microaggression, an indignity or a slight, that people will become enraged. And so my invitation is to talk with each other because, as I say to my class, I will engage in microaggressions all the time. We can't prevent them. What we do have to focus on is repair, and how we heal things, right? It's not possible to prevent harm. And so I encourage people in my classroom to not act as though we don't all engage in microaggressions all the time, right? To meet each other and to have a conversation with each other rather than dominate or tell someone how to think, correct someone or demand something. We know when we demand we go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and we can't think anymore. And so many times we've seen someone commit a microaggression and other people demand, and that person can't stop. Then they can't stop engaging in the microaggression, right? Because their prefrontal cortex is offline. So staying regulated, and yeah, really embodying humility. We all engage in these things. It's not just the other person.
I want to highlight and underscore what Kavita just said about the importance of repair. Repair is perhaps our most fundamental concept in improving relationships. We all do this, right? We all are hurtful to others. And if we can engage in a process of repair, we know this in families, we know this in couples from John Gottman's work. We see this all the time, that this is in repair is such a fundamental process. And when we are able to engage in repair, for example, in my work with parents and children, when parents are able to repair angry moments with their children, children learn a really vital lesson. That is that bad feelings can be repaired. And that is a tremendous lesson. So I just wanted to underscore that.
Absolutely. Which, of course, goes back to even the beautiful, beautiful studies by Edward Tronick from 30 years ago, right? Showing that good dyads of mothers and infants and not such good dyads really had the same, I think it was about 30% of uh, miscoordinated interactions. The difference lay not there, but in the question that both of you so highlight: how fast is the repair managed by this dyad? And that's the critical element. I wanted to ask both of you, what brought you to be so interested in this kind of work, in conflict resolution and related kinds of work?
Kavita, do you want to go first on that?
I I've always, I'm an immigrant, a baby immigrant. I was born in India, brought to the United States when I was just shy of 2 years old. And that experience, I have only come to realize in recent years, has been foundational to who I am. We moved, nobody talked about it. We just did it. And Vamic people's work has helped me to understand how central that has been. And so for me, I've always been drawn to visiting other countries. I have a natural tendency to just fit right in and assimilate and connect with the local population. So international psychology was always something that I wanted to do. And working with critical incidents, people, in the deepest moments of despair, always felt like the best way to use my skills and my privilege. I have such a privileged life here. It feels critical to be able to use my skills in the best way possible. So for me, I was drawn to that work for first, which is conflicts internationally, and then, transitioned to then begin to do some of the work here more nationally. But it's incredibly gratifying and fulfilling to be able to do that work.
Thank you. And
So
you, Ken?
for me personally, this is what I have done every day, many hours a day for 40 something years, is to help. I'm a child and family psychologist primarily, and to help families listen to each other more constructively, solve difficult problems. And I realized that the principles that I use, many of the principles that I use in my daily work with children and families, are applicable to other kinds of disagreements and other kinds of um, problems. So for me, it comes from what I've done in the course of my clinical work.
So, thank you both very much. Let me check with Dr. Torres if we have some questions in the chat that we would like to give an opportunity to have some discussion of. So, Dr. Torres,
Yes, so there's a question here from Stephen Van Wagoner. Truly wonderful presentations to both of you. It seems like listening to the other stories is a key component you both promote for moving toward dialogue. How might you apply that to families where ruptures have occurred and family members have ceased talking and to some extent already know each other's stories?
They may know each other's stories, but they may not really recognize each other's concerns. And in families, parents are concerned about their children's behaviors. Children have a feeling that things are unfair, and they're not really listening to each other. So the emphasis on concerns, as I said, is a game changer in families and in politics. The origin of the best worked out program for this comes from Ross Greene and Stuart Ablon, and it's called collaborative problem solving. And the idea when there has been a rupture in families is for parents to listen to their child's concerns, not their behavior, but their concerns, to invite them to talk about their concerns, and then to present their own concerns. And again, this is a different form of conversation. Instead, we're talking usually about behavior, what you should do, what you should not do. This is the punishment. But listening to concerns, stating parental concerns, which are often about safety and kindness, and then inviting a problem-solving discussion to say to a child, so what do you think we can do about how to solve this problem, which changes the channel. The child is no longer in the channel of how can I get my way, or I'm so angry because they are not fair and my brother or sister gets everything and I don't. It changes the channel to how can we solve a problem? And then I was listening, to go back to your question, you read, I'm listening to dialogue, or not dialogues, debates on TV, and politicians are never talking this way. It's always a debate and an attempt to convince, and it's never an attempt to understand a concern. So that would be
yes.
that's my general.
So I that's thank you, Ken. I think also though that we see a growing phenomenon, or this is what some indications show, of cut-offs in family relationships, not just the conflict between parents and children who are still living in the same home, but cut-offs between family members who are all adults. And perhaps the question was also a little bit about that. And I can say a few words to it as well. I actually wrote a paper about it a few years ago. But Kavita, do you want to say something about this? About uh, unmanaged conflicts that lead to cutoffs between family members who are adults?
Sure. I don't impose my agenda when I'm working with the client. If I'm working with the family that has a rupture, I want to know what my client wants, right? How is the rupture impacting them? Maybe their life is better. I don't, So I'm asking the client, is this working for you to not talk to this family member? Sometimes it is. Other times it's deeply painful, and they say no. And in that case, I'm then following them and helping them to tap into humility and the desire to, and what it would mean to listen without having to agree whether or not dignity is possible.
Yeah, I think I also wanted to throw in there, there is a lot now on the internet about these toxic relationships and all kinds of recommendations about uh, how how it's best for us to get out of all kinds of toxic relationships. And of course, sometimes, as you said, people need to, and people's lives are better when they cut off from a certain relationship. And sometimes it seems almost like it's another aspect of our cancel culture. And it's something that we need to uh, somehow be aware of. I wanted to go back to Dr. Torres, though, and see if there are some more questions before we go on.
Yes, and I
Dr.
just want to
Torres?
remind the audience, I don't think we said it up top, that we are solely taking questions from the chat. We are not opening the mic to the audience today. Um, this is this will be an interesting one. This came in during Dr. Barish's, but I'm gonna post it. Do you feel there are people in the world that do not have a conscience and therefore can never feel empathy?
There may be some, but there are variations in the degree of empathy that we are actually born with, right? Women in general are more empathic from the day they're born than men are, however but that does not mean that there's not a lot of overlap. But I think that those people without any empathy are rare. And what happens is people restrict their circle of empathy, their circle of concern, to those that are like them. And the more threatened they feel, the more their empathy is buried or eroded. So there's this tension between openness and threat, and that none of us can be empathic all the time, but none of us are without a conscience all the time, or very few of us without a conscience all the time. And so we have to understand the conditions, what has led to this erosion of empathy. And usually it will be a feeling of indignity, of disrespect, and of resentment and fear. So very few people entirely without a conscience.
All right, and that previous question about conscience and empathy came from Gail Kastner. Anybody else want to chime in on that one? Otherwise, I'll give the next question. All right, this one comes from Lauren Hinkle. I am curious if you have any more suggestions on ways to address cancel culture if we witness it happen.
Yeah, sure. I think not doing it, right? If we see it happening, bringing attention to the idea that that's happening and speaking to the person doing it in a place that they can hear it. Or if it's happening in front of you, to be able to say, I actually see it a different way. I engage in that same microaggression all the time, and I want to do better at it, and I want to join you in figuring that out together. Right? So not joining with cancel culture by cutting someone off, but trying to identify that pattern and bringing the consciousness to the idea that we all do these things that we're so mad about, that we can own that in a humble way and connect rather than pile up on someone.
Mm. Ken, do you have anything to say about that?
I agree. I think that uh, the the worst form of cancel culture, from my understanding, is when there is self-cancellation through fear. That cancel culture has created a climate where people are afraid to speak. They don't commit a microaggression. They just are afraid to say how they feel. And that has to be addressed, I think, at an institutional level or a systems level, not necessarily at an individual level only.
How would you suggest that an institution might address it?
Well, I think for example, it's happening at universities, and universities have to create programs. I would like universities to create programs like Kavita is working on for the university community, where people listen to each other, and where people um, uh, engage, I would say, in intellectual charity, in intellectual humility, try to turn ideological problems into pragmatic problems, to treat other people, to listen to someone else's stories. And if universities make this a value of the university, and these are not programs to convince anyone, right? They are um, programs for dialogue and for working together. I think that would be the best way, that on an institutional level.
So, I'm thinking finally in recent years, we have the concept of trauma-informed care as an overarching philosophy about any kind of institution and any kind of service that's being provided to be done from a perspective of recognizing what happened to people, how it might impact them, and their response to whatever it is that you are doing with them and how you're doing it with them, right? And it's become an overarching philosophy that is implemented by creating trainings about it in every organization. And actually, the beauty of it is when it trickles down to something that any service has to be sort of considered against. Like, how are we doing? I don't know. How are we providing service for this particular population in this particular institution? What are our procedures? What is our structure? Does it really reflect the ideas of trauma-informed care? In a similar way, I would like, of course, to see programs such as Kavita is describing, but I would like to see something overarching at universities, not just programs that some people will participate in and some not, but some kind of an overarching, like trauma-informed care philosophy and approach that will be presented in every classroom and in every course, that this is the way we do it here, whether it's about international affairs or about chemistry. This is the way we do what we do here. We listen according to your principles, Ken. We listen in the way that you describe it, Kavita, in every classroom and in every course as a fundamental philosophical change in what we think is appropriate discourse in any kind of context.
I agree. I agree, and I think that there would be from the professors I've talked to, that would be very welcome in most universities.
Mm.
I
Well,
always I
mm,
was just gonna say, I often hear from the top when I hear from the top leader of an organization, like the president of a university or president of a hospital, then I'm most encouraged because that when that top leader comes with vulnerability, and I've seen these kinds of transformational leaders that are not afraid to be seen as fallible or wrong or not knowing everything. I love those moments when the top leader comes where we can really do something to help the entire system and certainly use trauma-informed care to frame much of the work that I do.
mhm. And also difference-informed discourse. That should be perhaps the new sort of, instead of trauma informed, another model for sort of pervasive change. Dr. Torres, do we have one last question to address?
Let's see. From Ruth Simon, what do you do if one family member, adult child, believes that their relationship with a parent is toxic, but the parents want to heal the relationship?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you well.
I guess following on the family rupture, what do you do
Yes.
if a family member, adult child, believes that the relationship with the parent is toxic and the parents want to heal the relationship?
Ken, I think that's a question for you.
Well, first, the parents have to listen to the child and understand what, from the child's perspective, an adult child, why they feel that the relationship is toxic. They are going to I'm going to guess that they feel that they are not being heard, that the parent is not listening to them, and to understand that listening is difficult, but it has to begin. It is really some version of a collaborative problem-solving process, understanding the child's concerns, and then the parents have the opportunity to present their concerns. And again, I found in talking about this with families, with friends, with people who disagree, that simple shift from opinions to concerns changes the nature or changes the nature of the conversation.
I
I
tend
actually wanted
to,
so
I was
I
just,
just wanted to oh, Kavita,
go
please
ahead, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say,
I just
when,
wanted to find oh,
go.
go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, I think everybody has to listen to each other. Adult child has to listen to parents. Parents have to listen to adult child. If you have them all in the room, great. We don't always have that luxury. I like when there's real contentious challenge happening in the family. I like to talk to each member, and have the other members just listen. Because I'll ask the one member questions and disarm them. And often they say things that really surprise the family member who's not engaging actively in that moment.
Mm-hmm. I just also wanted to throw in there a tiny little detail, and that is that Dr. Coleman from California actually focuses almost entirely and only on these issues of how to manage rifts between adult children and parents, and he has a lot of material online. Just because I'm saying it because I know that it is a growing problem, and so it's important to know about him as another resource specifically for that. So we are at the very last few minutes of our program. I wanted to deeply express my deep gratitude to you, Kavita, and to you, Ken, for accepting my invitation and giving of your precious time and sharing so generously your expertise and your experiences and your opinions. And Dr. Torres, thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you had to do to make this possible and have it run so smoothly. And thank you, everybody who attended. It is a great privilege to be able to share this with you and to see the interest. And it's very hope inspiring to see the interest in these topics by so many people. Thank you, everybody, and be well and be safe.
And thank you, Irit, for inviting us. And Felix, can I ask you a question before you go?
You sure may.
Um, there were a lot of questions in the chat. Is there, which I would like to read? I haven't had a chance to read. Is there some way that you could send that to us?
I sure can. Yes, I can.
Well, thank you so much, Irit, for having us, and to all of you for joining us here on the beginning of your busy week.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Don't forget to support the NGO Committee on Mental Health by becoming a member. I dropped in the link there for everybody if you would be so inclined to join the committee. Thank you everyone for joining us.
I would be happy to. This was a terrific discussion. I think we were on the same page, literally, really very much on the same page. And
Right.
but
But even if we wouldn't have been, we would have had a good
yeah, we would have
discussion.
listened. We would have been able to
Listen
listen.
to each other.
We would have tried to model what we preach.
Right, right.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.